Alright, so we're going to be talking about the Starfinder rule set, and particularly my thoughts on the Starfinder playtest. Because I did playtest this quite a bit with my own group that I frequently play Pathfinder with for my in-person home game. We played online in Foundry, and then I also ran an in-person game that involved a lot of brand new people and a GM that is not comfortable with necessarily running games, that being their first Pathfinder 2 adjacent game that they have run, but they have GM'd 5e before. So I have a lot of experience with the stuff that I can draw upon, and there will be some scenarios where I don't have as much experience with that particular part of the rulebook, and I'll clarify when exactly that happens. But I just felt like me being able to have the PDF up and show things would be beneficial for this video in particular, because I'm very much in that engineering major grind set right now, so I don't have that much time to edit stuff together. So we're going back to the low budget jank stuff. But in any case, I want to first start this video by talking about stuff that I definitely did like. And I liked how range weapons interact with cover and made battle maps matter a lot more. Things like flight being more accessible can add a lot of texture. And I liked how the emphasis on range combat made me have to evaluate things a little bit differently between Pathfinder 2 and Starfinder 2. A lot of my criticisms will go from Starfinder 2 not doing enough to differentiate itself from Pathfinder 2, and player characters not being given enough choices. Those are going to be my main genres of critique. But I first want to start by looking at some of the monsters. And not all of these monsters are actually printed in this playtest rulebook, but would have rather been printed across all of the different previews that we got. And I want to start by talking about the Glitch Gremlin. And so here I've just pulled it up on Pathfinder Nexus. It's all pretty standard news, revealed to that be the thing that holds the glitch aura. But I have a very specific concern with this. It has straight up Thunderstrike, which does a pretty hefty amount of damage. A lot of characters will be in metallic armor, and it is rough for those characters. As a level -1, to be able to launch out a powerful burst spell option, along with, well, delete just mostly to interact with glitching and interact with this core theme, but there are a lot of creatures that just kind of have random things that punch way above its level. The Glass Serpent is also very much a punishing creature to fight into. For my game with newer players, we designed it from scratch, and we actually were going to have a ship glitch out. But we were afraid to use Glitch Gremlins in that scenario because we didn't want a new player to get hit by a Thunderstrike and then get one shot. Because a lot of those pre-made characters have order of like 16 HP. Ish. And this can do that if you critically fail your save. It's very reasonable for this to put you down to dying 2 immediately without anything else going on, let alone it having a range attack and it having a melee attack that can do that last bit of chip damage. While also having Electric Arc to be able to constantly be zapping people and doing a range attack plus a saving throw ability, we figured this might be too much for a level -1 creature, so we were scared to throw it out into our group of new players, which I think is fine, but I do think that with a lot of the playtest creatures, the level might not be fully accurate, where there are a few notable creatures that are overtuned for their level, this being one of them. But honestly, if that was a deal breaker for this game, I would not be playing Pathfinder 2e, because those Hydras, they hurt. And those trolls, if you do not have the thing to turn off the regeneration, they will wipe you. Lesser death exists. And like, I don't think I need to say much more on this topic, but I tend to be very careful about giving things these heavy burst options, particularly in early game, when health totals tend to be a bit lower. But, you know, minor criticism. And I think my biggest criticism is how guns were implemented and how that has an influence on class design. Because I think the Starfinder 2e playtest is trying to please too many masters at once. because it is trying to make it so that the equipment plays nice with Pathfinder 2e in terms of the armor and weaponry. But it is also trying to enforce a range-focused meta rather than a melee-focused meta, and it's not quite getting there with just like abilities on each class alone. So it feels like every single range class will need to have something to boost the flat damage of abilities. And there's a pretty easy explanation for why. If you would look at this graph over here, this is percent damage when we have a range attacker down here versus a melee attacker. This is actually the range attack with nothing else going on. You can see, at those levels 1 and 2, when most players will be starting the game and getting their first experience, a strength character with a D8 weapon is going to be massively outperforming them by almost double their average damage output. Pistols feel like pea shooters in the early game. And like, yeah, it evens out later on, but like, if a player feels like they aren't doing any damage as a character concept that is meant to do damage, they're not going to play till these level 7, level 8 when their math equalizes. And so that means that a lot of classes such as Operative thus need to have a damage booster somewhere in their kit to make pistols viable. And then that makes me worried about like, well, how do you make another range character when Operative already exists and has all these crazy abilities to make range damage that good? And I don't know how you can follow up Operative as a class, even if you want that to be the baseline for Starfinder range attackers. Because like, Operative blows out every single Pathfinder 2 range attacker just completely out of the water if you're looking at damage. It just does. And I think that's going to cause issues with cross-compatibility of classes, and the guns in Starfinder are going to be cross-compatible with Pathfinder, but it's like, that's also kind of awkward. I'd much rather all that awkwardness get shoved into one area that the GM then needs to be extra careful of, and I'd like for that extra awkwardness to be shoved into the weaponry rather than the classes. Because something interesting happens if you add half your stat to your damage output. You start at around 65% of the damage output of the D8 weapon with strength added. And I think that's fine. And then that also equalizes as you get more sources of damage later on via weapon specialization at 7 and damage runes at 8. Or rather, damage augments, however you want to phrase it. And so this is barely a damage bump late game, but it really experientially helps out this massive early game trough. And how would I add half stat to damage? And well, I'd come up with a new trait called Precise that says something along the lines of, when striking a creature within your first range increment, you get to deal an extra half dexterity of precision damage. As long as they're within your first range increment, or something along those lines. So that way, these guns very much want to play in their first range increment. It prevents massive sniper battles from being the main way to play, because you want to approach to get into that first range increment a lot in order to get that precise damage off. And what if the gun doesn't make sense to have precise? Then what would you do in that scenario? Like, well, Guns and Gears kind of already fixed this issue by having another way of getting flat damage via kickback, and another way of getting flat damage such as scatter. And I think that using those to experientially make the guns feel less bad for classes that don't have direct damage bumps will make guns more fun for characters that are not necessarily martials. Because Gishy casters, I think, should be able to use guns. Because I think guns are a very fun thing. And that's a main draw of the setting, is you get to have a laser gun. So I want the laser gun to be good. Hey, so I'm just inserting this into the video and editing. Hello, chat. But there are other traits that also can boost direct damage in like interesting ways, such as Arc here, which lets whatever damage you do also bounce to another target, but be a little bit less. And this is another way you could add flat damage and make weapon choice more interesting. You have stuff like Boost if you want to have more action intensity for the potential of higher damage output. And there are all these other interesting ways you can make traits that have weapons do more damage. I just think that guns should generally be power budgeted, as what they are now plus 1 extra damaging trait. And then I think that a lot of the gaps people are complaining about with ranged weaponry will kind of start to fall away, as I do think that melee should still be doing slightly more damage. I just don't think that it should be doing double the damage of a standard ranged attacker. But hey, that's my thought. That's the end of the weapon segment of the video, I guess. Ooh. I already have like full videos on what I think of like the classes after my first reading. Most of that still holds true. And I do want to add one more note onto my discussion of operative, and that is simply how operative defines the term gun. So I'm going to quickly scan down to operative. Operative. Because the operative had to define gun. So a gun is any ranged weapon with the analog or tech trait. Now, I'm going to ask a very simple question. There's a weapon called the star knife, or the shooting star knife, that is thrown. It is under the melee weapon category, though. So, now, a reasonable reading would be that this is a melee weapon all the time, even when you're making a ranged attack with it. But if you're throwing it as a ranged attack, wouldn't that make it a ranged weapon? So would that make it a gun? I don't think there's a cleaner way to define this. It's just kind of weird how it interacts with thrown weapons that are otherwise melee. And like thrown weapons in general, because if they make a weird thrown weapon, operative then looks at that and says, gun. If you had a cyber shuriken or something, that's a gun. And I think that's kind of weird. I don't have anything more to say on it other than it is a little bit weird, but I'm just going to point it out. And the other thing that I think was a bit off to me is Soldier. Apparently some people feel that Soldier was weak, but experientially that was not my experience in the slightest. I feel like Soldier was the strongest class that I've played with in basically all my playtest games, except for the one that used the pre-gens, but I think that's because there's a massive divide in power level between different subclasses, with Bomber far and away being the strongest soldier and blowing a lot of other things out of the water, just because the ability to build a dexterity-based soldier with con dex, get a lighter set of armor because whatever, use a big gun and use your primary fire or your focus fire, whatever that ability is, let me look it up, but the ability to use your primary target to get an attack off for the same action cost of the two actions. You do the area attack, that's guaranteed to do some damage, then you have an attack come in after, you maybe throw out a debuff during that because they maybe became suppressed, and suppressed on a successful save if you're a bomber, and also you didn't hit any of your allies because you're playing a bomber, and that secondary strike is like as good as if you were like a full marshal invested in shooting, because like, you know, you can build dexterity, nothing's making you build strength, and then you do that, and then you get to demoralize them using Constitution, which is your key ability score. And it's very hard to disrupt that, because they have so tanky, they have so much HP, they can threaten at a pretty decent range increment, and there's no way for them to mix up that action economy, because why would they do anything else except primary target, deal damage to the air effect, deal damage to the strike, debuff using their main class features? I don't see why they would reasonably take any other set of actions. And this is where, if an illusion of choice argument was made, I would actually agree with it. Despite being known as a guy that says utility is power, I think that when it comes to things like Soldier and Operative, their central gimmick is so strong to make up for guns being balanced to a Pathfinder 2e standard that it makes no sense to approach them from any other angle if you are looking to squeeze the most power out of a character. Because that's one of the things I think Pathfinder 2 does an exceptionally good job of. If you want to squeeze the maximum power out of Pathfinder 2 character, you need to have your thumbs in as many pies as you physically can get access to. Having a character that can heal when it's necessary is very, very strong, and is more strong than just making your main attack 5% better or whatever. But when it comes to looking at the soldier, being a bombard soldier just lets you negate all the downsides of your thing of just shooting out area attacks. Primary target makes you have really good damage output that's just pretty decent. You can do this all at range, and there's no real reason to opt into doing anything else because this is so gosh darn strong. But I have some ideas on how to rework this, but again, it involves changing guns, because I think this is the way to make Soldier work with how guns are right now. I just don't think how guns are right now needs to be how they always are. So, my primary idea for fixing Soldier, this is just my opinion, the designers are free to do with whatever they want, it's just that Soldier right now, honestly, I don't see a reason to play anything other than Bombard. I think the other ones are really interesting, but, you know, never mind. My idea is you let the guns that normally only area fire, give them the ability to make strikes like normal, make them unwieldy. Give soldiers the ability to ignore the unwieldy trait. So that way soldiers then become these big bulky weapon characters that then use these weird weapons that nobody else can really utilize properly. But soldiers can strike several times with these unwieldy weapons, maybe just taking an extra large multi-attack penalty of -6, -12, or something like that to balance it out. However you want to do it. And then, instead of primary target, because primary target really, really incentivizes just throwing out the area fire and doing nothing else, swap that out with something that says, if you don't have a multi-attack penalty, you can choose either the avoid friendly fire of Bombard, or them being suppressed on a normal successful save. And then there's a choice of, okay, if I attack, I'll get a multi-attack penalty, and then my big explosion will hit my friends, or I can do my explosion, avoid hitting my friends, and then take my second attack with the multi-attack penalty. And that then becomes a decision point for the soldier. And then, do I even want to go for that extra strike? Would I rather do the demoralize with my constitution intimidation? And you then have a lot more decisions fall out of that, while still keeping their core identity of, I'm a big guy with a weapon who shoots and maybe applies a debuff. It keeps that core identity, it lets them do heavy damage, maybe even more damage than the current iteration of Soldier, but it makes them do that through a way that forces them to make choices. Because I feel like that's what's really missing from Soldier's kit right now. I have seen the player that played that Soldier, that was a Bombard Soldier, for like a few sessions, and mentioned, wow, I'm doing the same thing every turn. I'm like, yep. It's like, and I see no way that I should do anything else. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. And that was a shame for both of us, because we were both the same type of player that loves to be overloaded with options and pick different things. And there is something to be said for having a simple class. But I don't want to see area guns be neutered for the sake of soldier primary target being so strong. I want to see guns be ridiculously powerful. The lore says that the previous iteration weapons, the archaic weapons, became archaic because the modern weaponry blew them out of the water. But we don't really see that mechanically. So I'd love to see guns get a tune up across the board, and martial classes have a few abilities tweaked so that they have more decision making involved. That's one of the major things I'd like to see. And then my other big bugaboos that I didn't mention in my original videos were involving the Mystic. Because I still think that the Mystic has far too much stuff, but I can also now experientially talk about how Transfer Vitality felt in play. And how it felt is, my player did not want to track the exact 26 hit points of their Vitality network in our level 5 game, because it recovered slow enough to the point where it didn't really matter. So it's just like, I'm just going to use one action, drop 26 points into that guy, and we aren't thinking about it for the rest of the fight. It was basically just a one action focus spell to heal somebody. And that's how it was played as. Because they didn't want to track the exact amount of hit points to their Vitality network, because it really didn't matter that much. You just kind of launch it out, and it does its thing, and then you use the rest of your kit, all your extra spell slots, your arm proficiencies, the fact that you have healing focus spells as a healing subclass. It's so much stuff they can do. I still think they should be 3 slots, but even without that, I think Vitality Network should be charge-based, where instead of it being you have a floating amount of hit points, you have a floating number of charges, and each charge can heal for maybe like 2 plus your level. And you start with 2 charges, and you get 1 more charge when you increase rank in your chosen skill of your subclass, getting its term. Your connection skill. When you increase your connection skill, you can then get more maximum charges in that pool. And that's how I'd rather see it done, because I think it's easier to track how many of my 5 points do I have in a level 20 game compared to how many of my 86 hit points do I still have in my pool. And like, yeah, that makes Vitality Network a bit stronger, just in general at those higher levels, and maybe a little bit weaker in the early game. But I think that's fine, because it has you still regain vitality things. It becomes more interesting in my mind. And it becomes easier to track. Also, there were questions in the playtest feedback about how you'd feel with cross-compatibility and playing with class in Pathfinder. Mystic is the Starfinder class I would ban on a purely power level basis. Because Mystic, right now, if it was printed into Pathfinder as is, in like my mental tier list of the classes, it would boot everything else out of S, put another tier between itself and S, and then have everybody else start B tier. Because it's just that efficient as a caster / healer, that I would need to hard justify why my party could not include a Mystic, because it has that much raw power behind it. It is a really cool class. I love its focus spells. I think Vitality Network has a bunch of ideas to it, but having all that along with arm efficiency, 8 HP, and extra slots is just too much power for a caster. And I've already talked about why I don't think 4-slot casters are a good way to bump up caster power budgets, because this disproportionately benefits advanced players like me, who really know how to exploit having extra spells. So for the sake of newer players and that newer player experience, I'd love to see casters have more iconic abilities like Vitality Network that can greatly swing a fight. And I have a minor note on the Witch Warper, because I did play like 4 sessions with the Witch Warper, and I can now report on how often I saw its subclass abilities. Like its little aura that put on the ground, and its things that keep it grounded, because all of them came up a grand total of this many times. 0. It never came up. I, as the GM, never actively tried to build a scenario where it would come up, but I think that if it's a major keyword ability of your class that your subclass makes a big deal about, it should be generally applicable and it should be generally strong. So I'd love to see power budget be taken out of their spell slots and put back into those special abilities, because Witch Warper promises to be this really cool class about weird time stuff happening around you, and you being this caster that is channeling energies from other areas and warping the world around you. But the mechanics always kind of fall short of that. You feel like a wizard who hit the gym a little bit. And I think that's kind of a miss for me personally, because I would love Witch Warper. I think its thematics are probably the coolest in the entire game, but it just isn't there mechanically. And I think that's a real shame. My notes on Solaran have actually changed. I actually like this class a lot more now, because in the playtesting, I have seen that its subclass abilities for both Black Hole and Supernova put in a massive amount of work. The being able to dazzle or blind people was massive and was probably the only reason my party didn't get TPK'd in that level 1 game. where my level 5 game, we played with a black hole. Slarn, who was using it to pull people out of cover, bring a bunch of enemies nearby for the bombard soldier to then shoot onto all of the enemies, explode them all, because not even spacing out the enemies 30 feet apart would stop them from getting bombard soldiered because of black hole. It was a pretty neat combo that did get used a couple times, and I think that is sweet, and I love both those abilities. I still think Binaric Assault, just because it requires you to make a ranged shot, is going to be quite a bit weaker than these other two. That might be intentional because balance gives you more choice of which one you start in, but like, I do think that they're flare, because when the new player did try to use flare, we had to correct them and say, no, that's a max range, not a range increment. You can't actually use that. And they were visibly disappointed by that. And also they were told, oh, it's also a lower modifier. And then it just never got used, because why wouldn't you just stride and attack? I think that the solar shot should still be brutal and have a range increment. But then after that, I think the entire class is great and doesn't really need much change at all. And then I have one final note for the Envoy based on my playtest experience. I don't even really need to pull it up for this, but it has key ability score Charisma, and I don't feel like it uses Charisma that much. Maybe if you used class DC more, or stuff like that, but the only time I really see Charisma used is when you're adding half your Charisma modifier in Get 'em. And that's the only time I really think it matters. So I think that it's very reasonable to play an Envoy and just dump Charisma down to like a plus 14, or rather plus 2. Because Remaster got rid of the ability scores and it's just modifiers now. And then you can put that extra investment into Dexterity, Int, Wiz, etc., and then become more of a Jack of all trades type stat array, which I think is better for Envoy, because it's more beneficial to be able to utilize all these various skills, because you have a lot of skill trainings and a lot of skill feats you can gain access to, so having a little bit of investment across the board could be very beneficial for them. So they don't feel like a charisma key attribute class to me. I'm not quite sure what could be changed for that, but that is my opinion and how they feel to me personally. In terms of the spells in the book, I enjoyed reading through them, and I don't really think I have much to add to that discussion, just because my players are not the kind of people to really go hard, look through every single piece of equipment, and min-max their characters to hell and back. I do that when I'm going to be a player in a long-term game, but I was GMing, and I didn't want to take away my players' freedom of buying their own items, and I wanted to see what they found, like, appealing and attractive. And so we didn't end up using a lot of the modifications just because they were in the section of the book and they were a little bit hard to look through because there isn't an Archives of Nethys for the playtest. So my players just end up kind of ignoring those parts of the game. And I don't think there's anything the designers can really do about that one, but like, it shows how good online tools are for this game. So, yeah. That about summarizes my opinion about the Starfighter 2 playtest. Again, I really enjoyed my time with it. I just think that I have some bugaboos with it that would prevent me from wanting to run it for a long-term campaign. I could see myself doing like a short, maybe 2 levels thing, because that'll be enough for us to like get the sci-fi feel before the repetitiveness of classes like Soldier starts to wear on us. Because like that's fundamentally what I think my biggest issue is. It's the classes of how Operative will basically always go aim, shoot, shoot, or aim, shoot, reload, depending on your gun, and how Soldier will always do its area fire, move, and that's it. Yeah. On that, I really enjoyed the playtest. I loved how cover was a thing, loved the different move speeds. I do wish that there were more enemies that would try and rush down the range characters, like a melee thing that would run at them, then it let out a big area effect, or run at them and have reactor strike just to be there and be threatening. because I think that is an area of the combat chess I think is a little bit underfilled, given the creatures I saw from the adventures just in Foundry, pre-built. But yeah, like, fundamentally, it's a solid game, because it's built off the Pathfinder 2e engine, which is a solid engine. I just kind of wish that the weapons were made more different, and the classes were made under more similar paradigms, so that the classes are easier cross-compatible. And people just kind of know, yeah, equipment will be radically different between the games, because we already kind of have that assumption from the different augments. But hey, that's just my opinions. You can let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm completely infallible on this. I assume the designers have a better core idea of what they want from this game than I do, but this is just what I experientially noticed from my time playing with my various players. I don't think many of them filled out the survey response, but I did link it to them, and I said they can fill it out if they want, but I definitely filled out my survey. You can go fill out the playtest survey. You can go find it where you download the playtest PDF. So, with that, I'm signing off, and I'll catch you all next time. Fading to black.